Hey everyone. This time we read Final Fantasy VI by Sebastian Deken. So what Sebastian does in this book is he looks at the music of Final Fantasy. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at the video games. Don't really I don't really do that often. Like usually when I look at video games, I'm looking at the gameplay, the art style, that sort of thing. And I tend to forget about the music unless it's incredibly memorable. And a lot of the Square Enix games, or Squaresoft at the time, their music was exceptional. So we start off with Sebastian going over just the history of Final Fantasy and talking about the different music styles in Final Fantasy games. He does a lot of comparison to the music in Dragon Quest, which makes a lot of sense to me because those two series were running parallel, they were competing for most of the time until eventually Squaresoft bought Enix out, or they just merged. I forget exactly how that happened, but they eventually turned into Square Enix, and now the two series don't really have to compete against each other anymore. He brings up how Final Fantasy took some inspiration from Dragon Quest concerning its music. And I can kind of see that in the first game because it's they're a lot closer in the first few games. The first few games for both Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy are more like a high fantasy game. There's not a whole lot of science fiction that creeps into Final Fantasy yet. And I mean it gets in there, but it definitely doesn't go to the same extremes that it normally does, especially now. As the series goes on, it slowly morphs into, at least up to the point where I still enjoyed the games, it morphs into more of like a steampunk and then more into a cyberpunk game. And the music kind of adjusts as that goes along. Particularly with Final Fantasy VI, the music changes a lot because the game was just it's my favorite game in the series, and it just did something so different from the other games. I will say this, every Final Fantasy game I've played has had great music. Even in the games that I don't really care for and don't have any interest in revisiting, the music has never been bad in any of those games. It's always just been really great and kind of enhanced the mood of you playing the game. Or at least it tried in some of the games that I don't like. But it was just one of those things I had never really thought too much about. And when I was reading Sebastian's book, it made me think more about the music in the games and how, yeah, Squaresoft always had good music in the Final Fantasy games, and a lot of their other RPGs have very good music as well. As we move past kind of the history of Final Fantasy and its music, Sebastian gets into just the history of music in video games and kind of how it's changed over the years. When it started off, they couldn't do a whole lot. It was just some simple beeps and bloops and some pretty awesome explosion sounds, if I can at least say that. The Atari 2600, whenever something blew up, it was pretty awesome, and it kind of made the game just feel a little bit more fun. Even if the games were still pretty simple, they only took about 5 to 10 minutes to play. Whenever you got something to blow up, it was really great. And as we moved on through video game history, the music becomes more complex, obviously, just because the technology allowed them to do more, and a lot of the programmers and several of the musicians found ways to get more out of the hardware than what there was. He breaks it down really well in this, and I love the explanation because oftentimes when you just play these, you don't think about the work that goes into actually putting the game together. You just see the final product up on the screen. Sometimes it's not great, sometimes it's exceptional, and you don't necessarily think about all the hard work that goes into it. Once you got away from the arcade ports and you got more into the original games, like A Legend of Zelda, Dragon Quest, and Final Fantasy, you saw them not really have anything to build off of, so they don't have anything to say, okay, this is what it sounded like in the arcades, how can we replicate that? Now they had more freedom to kind of come up with a soundtrack that better fit like what they were doing. And that's when I think the music in the games really got great, like really, really great. They weren't trying to emulate something that already sounded better, they were creating things on their own. And you see them create a lot of very iconic songs, or at least very memorable songs. They don't necessarily all have to be iconic. And that was something that was really awesome, and I'm glad that Sebastian talked about it in this. Because when you go back and you listen to those 8-bit renditions of the Final Fantasy soundtrack, the Dragon Quest soundtrack, pretty much every Sunsoft game out there had great music. Obviously, Mario, Legend of Zelda, they have just very iconic soundtracks. It's something that you don't necessarily think about, and you don't always think about how these things have changed over time and how they've gotten better. I know I'm probably repeating myself quite a bit. Uh, I just I just really liked reading this, and I thought, as you know, it made me think more about other video game music as I was reading through this, not just Final Fantasy VI, but it made me think about games like Chrono Trigger, games like ActRaiser, that have great soundtracks. Some of them get remembered more than others. The fan bases definitely remember the music and everything like that, but it's never something that I thought about. It was either, the game has great music and I don't ever really think too much about it, or the game's soundtrack is awful and that just kind of fits with the fact that the game isn't very good and I didn't enjoy playing it. I'm not really sure what it was, but it's hard to kind of put my finger on it. I really liked reading this and reading the examples of music that are brought up, because I can go back and think, yeah, that is kind of how I felt while I was playing that game, and that's how the music sort of helped me feel that way, or kind of influenced the way that I felt. And yeah, it worked really well with certain iconic scenes, especially the opera scene in Final Fantasy VI. I think that scene's music was probably my favorite out of the entire game. So getting back on track here, we go back to something I had mentioned earlier, where Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy kind of split and they went their own separate ways as far as music. And Final Fantasy went to different genres, whereas Dragon Quest kind of stayed with its more, kind of a more traditional and high fantasy theme. That thing that you would think about when you're watching, like, a sword and sorcery movie or something like that. And Final Fantasy went in different directions and kind of tried new things and did new stuff. Some of it I didn't like, some of it didn't work very well for me. Others I thought it was great, and the same running theme through all those games that I've mentioned is Final Fantasy's music has always been really awesome. Then Sebastian goes through each of the characters in the game and talks about their theme music. This was really awesome. I honestly had not thought about this. It's not something I normally do think about, but yeah, the theme music for each of the characters and how it kind of fit with them and fit with their character arcs, how it changed over time, that was really fun to read. God, there was so much in this book, and all of those different, like, it was like revisiting a bunch of chapters from your favorite book and reading about the people in that book and learning more about them. It feels like every time I read something about some of these older RPGs that I like, I learn something new. And Sebastian did that here. He brought up all the music for the different characters, especially the main ones and the main villain. It's a really great read, and I love how he ties in the different parts of the plot, talks about how these characters change throughout the game, talks about how you can do things on different playthroughs, so you don't necessarily hear everything about a character on the first playthrough. You can try it again and do something different. I just thought that it was great how he used the plot and then tied in how the music goes with the plot to kind of enhance how you feel about that character and how you feel about the game that's or the story that's unfolding before you.
While going through the themes, I think this is where the book gets really, really great. It adds something more to the story and it adds something to the narrative that Sebastian is telling. It makes this book kind of stand out a little bit more, and it gives you greater insight into the characters of Final Fantasy VI. And he doesn't just limit it to the main characters. He also talks about Kafka, the villain in the story, and he talks about how his motivations change and how the music kind of makes you feel like he is a sinister threat, and he definitely is the big bad guy. Sebastian also talks about the marketing of the game and how it didn't match with the tone of the game. It's pretty cool to read that, and he ties it into the different narratives that he's talking about and how the tone of the marketing was sort of like, you're this great hero, you're going to go save the world. And the themes in the game, the music, and everything like that don't match what the marketing said. And in fact, it made the game stand out a lot more, and it made the game much better than what the marketing made it out to be. It was a much deeper experience, and there was just a lot more to it than the way it was marketed.
He also compares the music in Final Fantasy VI to the music in Chrono Trigger. And I think this is a really great comparison. I really love both of these games. I like Chrono Trigger a little bit more. There's no specific reason why I like it more. I just happen to like it a little more. And he talks about how music is used in both of those games very well. And yeah, it's just one of those. It's one of the parts in this book that makes it feel just more than what it is. I know I kind of ramble a little bit on this, but it's hard for me to kind of point out just exactly why I like this book so much. And I know I'm kind of struggling with that a little bit. I think it's because it examines something that I don't normally think about when I'm playing games, even retro games when I go back and look at them. I just kind of say to myself, oh, this game has good music, this game doesn't have good music, this game has a good story, this game has okay graphics for the time. I don't necessarily think about how the music enhances the different parts of the story, or at least I don't notice it I don't consciously notice it. It's just a really great read to go through this and have Sebastian break down each of the different parts of this.
I just want to briefly talk about the only thing I didn't like about this book, and that was the sheet music that's included. I don't really get... I understand why he put it in there, but I didn't really like the fact that it was there. Mostly because I can't read sheet music. While Sebastian does a good job of explaining what I'm looking at, it still was kind of weird, and it felt like those times when I would read a book and somebody would throw in just a block of basic code or assembly code, and like they would try to explain it, but it was more like a, here you go, here's this blob of stuff. And I would just look at it and go, yeah, I don't get why you put that here. So that's going to wrap things up for me, guys. I really love this book. It was a lot of fun to read. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day, everybody.